Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on the Wabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to Bushrangers in the Hunter Valley, a creative non-fiction series by Society member Narelle Austen. This series explores the people, places and forces behind bushranging in one of Australia's earliest colonial regions. Drawing on historical records, newspapers and local research, Narelle examines bushrangers not as legends, but as products of empire, punishment, resistance and survival. From Irish rebels and transported convicts to settlers, magistrates, police and the women whose lives intersected with outlawry, these episodes imagine the lives and interactions that may have unfolded in the Hunter Valley.
In this first episode of Bushrangers in the Hunter Valley, we note the various terms which refer to bushrangers historically, in the press, and in general parlance. We look at the socio-political context in Ireland and Britain, and then explore the factors which impacted convicts and bushrangers in the Imperial penal colony of New South Wales. In this and successive episodes, the focus will be on three of the most historically traceable bushranger gangs, their connections with people in the Hunter Valley, their actions, motivations, and their fates. Although the term bushranger is unique to Australia, their activities were not. Some transgressors who menaced and stole from travellers were known as footpads. They posed a serious problem in 18th and early 19th century in Britain, and the term was also used in early colonial Australia. They typically robbed travellers or pedestrians, often using violence and threats. Punishments for footpads were severe, including flogging, transportation, or hanging, because robbery with violence was historically treated as a capital crime. The terms highwaymen and highwaywomen were also used. Originally, their typical targets were stagecoaches, wealthy travellers, and mail coaches. Their weapons of choice were pistols, swords, and intimidation. In Britain, famous highwaymen were, of course, Robin Hood, who was not a highwayman, but rather a folk outlaw from medieval legend, operating in forests with bows and arrows. Robin Hood was a fictional embellishment by oral storytellers, writers and journalists who chose to romanticize revolt and crime. Stories and songs transformed medieval outlaw tales into early modern highwaymen romances. Real highwaymen were early modern robbers, using pistols on horseback, whose legends borrowed Robin Hood's aura of noble rebellion, which especially appealed to some sections of society and the press. Historically, there was the highwayman Claude Duval, who operated from 1643 to 1670. Known for his charm and gallantry, he supposedly spared a lady's life after dancing with her on the roadside. Then there was Dick Turpin, who lived from 1705 to 1739. In Britain, up to and including the 19th century, highwaymen were romanticized anti-heroes, seen as rebels against the rigid class system and religious persecution, not mere thieves. Ballads, pamphlets, and stage plays depicted them as stylish and defiant, living freely and dying bravely at the gallows. Later, in New South Wales, some bushranging leaders adopted this flamboyant attire and posture of chivalry towards women and children. Anecdotally, the famous First Fleeter Mary Broad, or Bryant, the girl from Botany Bay, was amongst the first highway women to be transported to New South Wales for assault and robbery on the roads in Cornwall, where she operated with her gang of 2 other women. On the second fleet ship, Neptune, we find records relating to Darcy Wentworth, a famously flamboyant highwayman who went on to become assistant surgeon at Norfolk Island Penal Settlement and a co-founder, major shareholder and director of Australia's first official bank, the Bank of New South Wales. He's considered to be the patriarch of one of the most influential dynasties in early colonial Australia. Although accused and acquitted of highway robbery several times, he actually came to New South Wales as a free immigrant, being from the Irish branch of an English aristocratic family. It's been said that his passage was paid in return for his promise to never darken the roads or gambling dens of England again. Unlike so many of his class, he remained in New South Wales until his death in 1827. It must be said that neither Mary Broad, Bryant, nor Darcy Wentworth continued highway robbery when they came to New South Wales. They're mentioned here to illustrate the varied backgrounds of people who, in Britain, were suffering, in Charles Dickens' famous words, hard times. Though, of course, times were harder for some more than others. Let's ask the question, were all highway robbers and bushrangers from England? No. Historically, in Ireland, there was a cohort of resistors known by various terms, including White Boys, United Irishmen, and Ribbon Men. They were mostly poor rural Catholics fighting against dispossession by their absentee landlords, the British authorities, religious discrimination, and hunger. The 1798 rebellion, United Irishmen Rising, was crushed by British authorities with a huge loss of life in which some reported tens of thousands being killed. Captured Irish rebels, including rank-and-file fighters and suspected sympathisers, were transported to Australia. As well as the United Irishmen, there were the Ribbon Men, who were members of a secret agrarian organisation in 19th century Ireland. Mainly active from the 1810s to the 1850s, they sought to defend tenants' rights and resist eviction. The Ribbon Men were regarded as a serious threat by the authorities. The British government and local elites suppressed the Irish by using the military and harsh laws against oath-bound secret societies, unlawful assembly, religious, that is, Catholic, expression, and of course, what they labelled as sedition by the Irish. Some of those captured were sentenced to death, but the majority were transported to New South Wales. After the failure of the second uprising in Ireland, known as the 1803 Rebellion, and the execution of its leader, Robert Emmet, his followers were also transported to New South Wales, reinforcing the colony's reputation as a dumping ground for Irish radicals. The Irish resistance continued after they were transported. This is evidenced in 1804 at Castle Hill near Sydney, in which the United Irish Convicts staged the Castle Hill Rebellion, or Second Battle of Vinegar Hill, as it was known, the largest convict uprising in Australian history. It was crushed by the British troops, but it shows how the revolutionary spirit carried over into the colony. Followers of Philip Cunningham, the United Irish leader of the Castle Hill Rebellion in 1804, were sent to Newcastle as punishment, although he was executed after capture. Hugh Byrne, Samuel Humes, and William Johnson, Irish rebels involved in 1798 or Castle Hill, were also later exiled to the Newcastle coal mines and lime-burning pits on the banks of the Hunter River. One of the main reasons for reopening the settlement at Coal River in the Hunter Valley in 1804 was to isolate and punish the Irish survivors of the Castle Hill massacre. So, how many bushrangers were there? Jane Wilson's Australian Dictionary of Biography entry on bushrangers offers a broad estimate, and while the precise number is uncertain, one researcher has identified around 1,200 individuals. She notes that there were almost certainly many more whose actions have since faded from the historical record. Who were these bushrangers up against? New South Wales eventually had 6 police forces: the Sydney Police, Native Police, Rural Constabulary, Mounted Police, Border Police, and the Water Police. The Native Police, or Native Mounted Police, were paramilitary forces made up largely of First Nations men who were led by European officers. The first Native Police force in New South Wales was established around 1825-26 under Lieutenant T.L. Nunn. Their primary role was to maintain order and protect settlers on the expanding colonial frontier. While colonial authorities described them as keeping the peace, they effectively enforced dispossession and expanded colonial control. The native police included expert trackers, usually from different clans to those in their assigned area, who used their invaluable knowledge of country to trace, capture, and bring offenders to be punished or brought to trial. From the beginning of the penal colony, native trackers had been invaluable to authorities, settlers, and explorers, by which, in their official form, often meant helping to violently suppress First Nations resistance to colonization in specific areas. Their operations were state-sanctioned and formed part of the broader frontier wars between First Nations people and colonists. The rural constabulary was often made up of former convicts who had served their time and were part-time, poorly paid, and poorly equipped. The mounted police were a paramilitary force and officially founded by Governor Brisbane on the 7th of September 1825 to patrol the outer areas of the settlement, and was made up of uniformed military personnel who were subject to military rather than civil authority. Their main jobs included pursuing bushrangers, guarding convicts during transportation or on road gangs, protecting settlers and maintaining law and order in the expanding colony, suppressing resistance to colonial expansion, patrolling rural districts, and keeping surveillance over isolated settlements. In addition, certain settlers assembled gangs with trackers to pursue and capture felons. What legal rights did individuals have? Although the basic presumption of innocence was a part of English common law, and therefore technically applicable in New South Wales, in practice it was unevenly enforced. This concept of innocent until proven guilty prescribes that there should be a primary assumption of innocence, and therefore a qualitative difference in the treatment received by accused, possibly innocent persons, and convicted, guilty criminals. The British laws, known collectively as the Bloody Code, was the name given to the British penal system in the 17th through to the 19th century that made over 200 offences punishable by death, many of them shockingly trivial. Here's a short list of the crimes for which you could be hanged. Cutting down a tree, any tree. Trees were treated as valuable property assets. Damaging or defacing a fish pond, in other words, stealing a fish from the Lord's carp pond, could be punishable by death. Stealing a handkerchief. Stealing anything worth more than 12 pence, about the price of a loaf of bread. Literally theft above a trivial value could get you hanged. Poaching rabbit or hare because stealing game from the Lord's land was considered a direct attack on the social order. Stealing livestock, even a single sheep, became one of the most common hanging offences. Being out at night with a blackened face. Just the state of your face could be considered proof of intent to steal. Being armed in a forest, even just carrying a stick, club or gun while in a royal forest, could be treated as evidence of banditry, and so required the legal deterrent to poaching and rural rebellion. Being a strong gypsy, which is vaguely defined, was the law which criminalized membership in certain traveling communities. It was to control nomadic or non-settled populations seen as outside the tax and property systems. Execution was possible on the second offence. Stealing from a shipwreck because shipwrecks were considered Crown property. Returning from transportation. If you were sent to Australia and somehow survived and managed to return, the penalty was death. As the Australian justice system was aligned to British law, let's look at how women were treated under British penal law. Since the 1624 Concealment of Birth Act, women were automatically presumed guilty of murder if they concealed the birth of an illegitimate child and the child died when no witnesses were present. Men involved were not charged. Women alone bore the criminal liability, and the burden of proof was reversed. Women had to prove the baby was stillborn to be deemed innocent. Although the Bloody Code didn't create many women-specific capital offences, its assumptions about property, morality, motherhood, and domestic roles meant certain laws hit women harder. In addition, as women were often responsible for feeding and caring for their children, specifically when the men were at war for the British Crown or searching for work in the towns and cities during the agrarian and industrial revolutions, they had little or no support. Arson was a gender-neutral offence, but women were disproportionately charged for burning domestic buildings, setting fire during marital conflict, and burning their own belongings because they and their possessions were seen as destroying property of the husband. Women who were convicted of domestic treason, for example, killing a husband or employer, were, until 1790, publicly burned alive. Men were hanged. Such were the general British laws. Returning to the lives of convicts in the penal settlement of New South Wales, who had been convicted under British law, what justice could they expect here? The colonial prisons and police lockups did not separate the accused from the convicted criminals because they imprisoned men, women, juveniles, and First Nations prisoners in the same confined spaces, and so they were unprotected against those convicted of violent crimes, including rape, assault with grievous bodily harm, and murder. In effect, the authorities and jailers often treated all prisoners alike, regardless of whether they'd been convicted or not. This meant filthy cells, poor ventilation, disease, minimal food, little or no bedding, heavy chains, leg irons, whippings, and physical abuse from guards, even for technically innocent prisoners. In New South Wales, in 1830, there was an attempt to curb the increasing activities of bushrangers when the Legislative Council introduced the Bushranging Act to suppress robbery and housebreaking and the harbouring of robbers and housebreakers. The Act gave the police power to arrest any person on the mere suspicion that he or she was illegally at large, with the onus of proof of not being a bushranger on the person arrested. Police were also given powers to search for stolen goods or evidence of harbouring criminals in the homesteads and huts of the general public. The Act was widely resented, and its legality was later questioned by both Governor Burke and Justice Burton. Burke thought the Act contrary to the spirit of English law, and Justice Burton stated that it was repugnant to the laws of England in almost all of its provisions. It has also been stated by Jane Wilson that the militaristic policing of the Bushranging Acts contributed to a strong current of resentment against the state and its protectors that is still evident in Australian society today. To review and particularize the first era of bushranging, we will focus on three of the most significant gangs which ranged in the Hunter Valley by looking at their interactions with authorities, settlers, and ex-convicts. In so doing, I'll outline a connection with a woman who is arguably our most historically documented female convict, Mary Molly Jones Morgan Mears Hunt, during the opening decades of the 19th century, when her homestead at Anvil Creek, near Greta, was the locus of the first period of bushranging in the Hunter Valley. Molly Morgan's long and productive life, which coincided with two famous bushranger gangs in the Hunter Valley, has deservedly received attention. However, the Newcastle Family History Society and others have extensively researched and produced documents and podcasts which reveal the lives of many other women transportees who lived before us in the Hunter Valley. The Newcastle Family History Society's publication, They Sent Me North, and the podcast series Felonious Females give an essential expose of our female forebears who lived and worked here. Some, like Molly Morgan, chose to stay and directly contributed to the socio-economic success on which we build. Our Hunter Valley town of Singleton also became synonymous with Irish outlawry and a hotspot for Irish convict rebellion. Initially in the Hunter Valley, the local escapees, some carrying their Irish religious and political baggage, and who became boys of the bush in the early 1820s, were seen as more high-spirited lads than those in other areas and the later gangs. In general, the early bushrangers were escapees from work gangs, prison barracks, and absconding assigned servants who had to work on the homesteads where some landowners and their overseers worked them and punished them mercilessly. The well-known harsh punishment they received goes some way to explaining why some settlers supported them. The bushrangers were firstly seen as avenging perceived wrongs perpetrated against the poor in general, and therefore a continuation of the British anti-authoritarian struggle, turning outlawry into a form of political and cultural resistance with deep Irish and Catholic roots in the first period of bushranging here. Molly Morgan is arguably one of the best-known convicts, settlers, and landowners in the Hunter Valley, where she lived and worked for over 20 years. She became known as the Queen of the Hunter Valley, being at one time one of the biggest landowners, who significantly contributed to the well-being of new settlers and children from her homesteads at Wallace Plains, Maitland, and at Anvil Creek in New South Wales in the early colonial days. Molly Morgan set up places in her homes where she cared for the sick, those who needed medical help and shelter, and possibly women in the precarious process of childbirth in which many women and babies died. Given Molly Morgan's presence in our valley, it would have been an extreme anomaly if she had not had contact with bushrangers whose locus was where she lived at the time, between Branxton and Maitland. Indeed, Mark Dunn, in his book The Convict Valley, referring to the Hunter Valley, writes that of the early gangs, the depredations of that known as Jacob's Irish Brigade, or Jacob's Mob, ranged from Branxton to Maitland. Molly Morgan's final homestead at Anvil Creek near Greta, on the track which became the major road known as the Great North Road, was strategically located for a relaxed long drink or two, a rest, a good feed, a story, gossip, a song, a spot of barter with the neighbours and passers-by. Molly's place was far enough from the towns of Sydney, Parramatta, the Hawkesbury, Maitland, Wallace Plains, and Singleton, Patrick's Plains, to provide a modicum of safety and help for early travellers. Was the geographical separation from Newcastle and Sydney authorities the reason Molly Morgan perched a relatively isolated homestead here, despite the risks of the spreading frontier wars between the First Nations people, the colonisers, and the bushranging gangs? Molly Morgan's Hill, near Greta, provided a good lookout over her line of road. Most of her people were a trusted few who had also been on the receiving end of the lash and depended on provisions from the trade, treatment, and the generosity of Molly Morgan. We can imagine the following scenario at Anvil Creek. One afternoon in 1825, one of Molly Morgan and her husband Joe's Irish male servants approached them to tell them to expect some visitors that night. He told them that these men were the ones who had escaped from the nearby property of the absentee landlord, Vickers Jacob, but would not harm them if they were welcomed. Molly Morgan's servant, Irish Frank, began.
"I've been with you for a few years, Molly,"
he said.
"I'm a free man now, but I choose to stay with you, and I'm grateful. I wouldn't do anything to change that. I wouldn't steer you wrong."
"Tell us what you know, Frank,"
ordered Joe.
"I know the young cove who is leading this gang. He's Irish, like me. Most of his boys are Irish too. His name is Patrick Riley. Dan Wilkins, their overseer at Vickers Jacob's farm, is a mean cove, as bad as he is lazy. He blamed Patrick Riley for losing 4 sheep. That'll probably amble back sometime soon for all he knows. Well, Overseer Wilkins went straight to Magistrate Reed's, his neighbour. James Reed slapped a sentence of 50 lashes on Patrick. Quick as that,"
said Irish Frank, clicking his fingers and shaking his head.
50 lashes of the cat is a harsh thing,
said Joe, who knew only too well how deeply the cat would cut.
"The magistrates have no tolerance for what they see as disobedience. Reed, Scott and the others have a reputation as tough and unforgiving men. We all know that. Go on, Frank,"
Molly insisted. Irish Frank continued.
"Reed's Overseer Wilkins works them hard and starves them as well. It's worse when Master Jacob is away, as he is now. They carted Patrick Riley off for a flogging in Newcastle, but he escaped. On his way back to Jacob's farm to see his mates, Riley took 2 horses from Magistrate Reed's for good measure. At Jacob's, his mates, Aaron Price, Larry Cleary and Paddy Clinch, went off with Riley. They'd had enough as well,
said Frank.
and by now there are some other chancers with them.
Look, Frank, if this is Riley's gang as you say, we know some of the story. This news spreads quickly. We know they're holed up around here somewhere, and we know they need food, but they haven't hurt anyone yet, so let's keep it that way,
said Molly. Irish Frank made the sign of the cross and swore in his mother's grave that, this once at least, they deserved a hearing. In fact, as Molly and Joe realised, this meeting could not have been avoided. Jacob's Irish Brigade raided farms for weapons, food and clothing, as did other Hunter Valley Farm convicts who sometimes joined the gang for a quick taste of freedom before giving themselves up, claiming to have been abducted at gunpoint. As days went by, local settlers organised an armed posse to track them down, but being warned, they vanished into the bush, which was their home. Locals wrote letters to Sydney newspapers pleading for help in the absence of a local police or military response. A visit from bushrangers was not to be taken lightly. So the Anvil Creek homestead prepared, hiding most of their stores, securing their horses in the barn, burying some weapons and ammunition, and placing rifles where the servants could reach them if necessary. Being isolated, Joe and Molly would have taught their men and women to shoot to protect themselves. The secluded back room of Molly's house was furnished with a long, dark cedar dining table, chairs, and casks of perry and beer. It also had a back door leading to the barn, and a small door and serving hatch connected to the big front room. The servants prepared the food. Their neighbours in the front room were encouraged to return to their homes, as Molly claimed her advanced age as an excuse for closing up a little early. It was something they'd never heard before, but out of respect they left. Her female servants and the 2 children went to their huts and locked their doors. Would the visitors be after more than food and blankets? As the night progressed, the homestead waited.
In this episode, we've traced the Imperial forces that shaped bushranging in New South Wales, British law, Irish resistance, transportation, and the harsh realities of colonial punishment. In the Hunter Valley, those pressures converged on the roads between Branxton, Maitland and Singleton, where escapees became organised, desperate, and increasingly political in their resistance. In the next episode, we move from context to encounter. We follow Jacob's Irish Brigade and their uneasy relationship with settlers, authorities, and one woman whose homestead lay directly in their path, Molly Morgan of Anvil Creek. What happens when survival, loyalty, and resistance meet across a table by lamplight, with food, drink, and weapons within reach? To find out, join Narelle Austen for the next episode of Bushrangers in the Hunter Valley, coming soon to Newcastle Family History Society podcast.